I'm glad to be here. I recognize I have about 30 minutes to try to lay out some things with you. So I'm going to do my best to stay within that time frame so that we actually do have time for questions. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. I'm not enamored of presentation slides, but the one thing they do is keep me on task. So I'm going to switch over to sharing the screen. And let's make sure I have up what I need to have up. Let's see. Okie doke. So hold on one second. The beauty of the technology is it never works exactly well. Okay, I'm in good shape now. Found what I wanted. Thank you. So you should be seeing a screen that is the beginning of the PowerPoint. Let me go on to a slideshow view of it and let's get started. Now I've entitled this term, these remarks, "This is Us, Educating Post-COVID, Post-Civic Unrest America." It's a tragedy or an opportunity. And I think that dichotomy is one that I want to play around with a little bit. But first and foremost, I do want to just take a moment of tribute to Professor Lee Stiff. I've known Lee for a very, very long time. And he's the one that taught me about bold, innovative leadership. Remember when he was first working with the Algebra for All initiative in North Carolina, and he said a phrase that I've never forgot, working with young people who were in a general mathematics class. And he said, we went into the project with the notion that nothing we do can hurt these students. That they were receiving such low-level instruction that anything, even the least amount of algebra we gave them, was better than what they were receiving. And that's kind of been a watchword for me. So indeed, I was really horrified on Saturday when I got the news that Lee had passed. I knew he had been sick, but you just never anticipate certain people leaving us. So I am humbled to be doing this because Lee asked me personally last year to do it. Real quick though, I also think it's important that I give you a land acknowledgement. I am from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it sits on the land of the Ho-Chunk. Their ancestral name is the Dejo. They have been on that property since time immemorial. In 1832, there was a treaty that forced them to cede the territory, and that was followed by decades of ethnic cleansing, where both the federal and state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. The history of colonization there informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And so today, the University of Wisconsin indeed respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of the state of Wisconsin. Dr. Marshall did a great job of telling you who I am, so I'm not going to spend much time here. I am Professor Emerita at UW-Madison. That's sort of a fancy way of saying I'm retired, but I will tell you that I am flunking with retirement. I'm getting an F in retirement. I have no idea how you're supposed to do this. I am the current president of the National Academy of Education. I'm a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and this year became a fellow of the Hagler Institute at Texas A&M University. So I'm spending several days each week interacting with my colleagues and graduate students there at Texas A&M. I'm going to give you the context of this talk because it really is an adaptation from a book I just started to work on. And I'm going to speak to you about 3 of the 7 ideas that I try to develop in the book. And the 3 ideas I want to talk to you about are saving the language of justice, saving justice in the midst of a pandemic, and saving justice via popular culture, also known as how hip hop can save us. And that may sound a little out there, but I would ask you to bear with me as I try to go through that notion. And in the talk, you know, the unspeakable thing will be spoken. The notion of protest, riot, insurrection, unrest. We have to talk about that. We don't have a choice. You have two juxtaposed pictures that are false equivalencies, that people protesting peacefully on behalf of the lives of Black citizens is not the same as people overtaking a Capitol building to overturn a fairly held election. They're just not the same. And we need to say that aloud. We can't make these false equivalencies saying, oh, well, that's just like, because it's not. So in terms of saving the language of justice, I want to say that while justice is seen as an approach towards being righteous or just or morally right, there are many interpretations of how justice is implemented. So for example, if we looked at Western interpretations of justice, you'll see they're often linked to individual grievances, you know, that I didn't get the justice that was promised to me. It stems from the ancient Greece and from the European philosophies that go something like cogito ergo sum. But those of you who study Western philosophy, you know that is a phrase emanating from René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. That my ability to think brings me into being. And with that notion, one thinks, okay, because I am, I'm entitled to justice. But Eastern interpretations of justice often link to community, not just individuals, and particularly community healing and affirmation. I have a talk that I have to record for the University of Johannesburg, where I'm receiving an honorary degree. Again, hoping to have gone last year, COVID came, and so we're going to do this remotely. But one of the things that's very apparent in that part of the world is the notion of Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. In other words, without the community, I cease to exist. And so if you have that interpretation of justice, that it is a community good, is very different than trying to argue for one individual right. And there's a variety of ways that we consider this notion of justice. Basic justice rarely is connected to the concerns of Black and Brown people. And seeing what we saw in Atlanta last week, I would also say Asian folks of Asian descent. So, and these connections aren't there despite the 14th Amendment. So we say liberty and justice for all, but we still make laws that inhibit people's right to vote, or we still make laws that don't allow them to make a living wage, or we still make laws that keep them from social benefits. We consider justice around the economy. You know, is $15 an hour too much for someone to make in a highly technological and very expensive society? We consider justice around criminal justice, and we see incredible disparities as to the sentencing and to arrests, and even around juvenile justice. There are disparities that exist. There are questions of environmental justice. You know, the fact that the water is bad in Flint is not everywhere in Flint, but it's in certain communities, or that there's lead paint in certain communities, or that there are toxic dump sites in certain communities. And then finally, social justice, which seems to be the one notion of justice that education has glommed onto. Now, I am actually going to try to trouble that notion, because I'm not convinced that social justice represents what we need to be focused on as educators. And different cultural groups come to the notion of justice from different vantage points. And that has to be part of our conversation. We talk about saving this language of justice. Well, many of the indigenous Americans view justice from the standpoint of sovereignty and treaty rights. So they're not interested in coming to the table if you're not going to talk about their sovereignty, if you're not going to talk about what you already agreed to and encoded in documents such as treaties. Many Latinx Americans view justice from the standpoint of linguistic sovereignty, the ability to speak my language, and la frontera. In other words, I'm back and forth across these border lines. That's a line you guys put in place, but that doesn't mean that that line has the same resonance and meaning for me. A colleague from UCLA, Danny Solorzano, always says, my family did not cross the border. The border crossed my family. And many Asian descent Americans view justice from the standpoint of heterogeneity and or hybridity, because we've used this racialized category, Asian Americans, but we've literally put most of the people in the world in this category, whether we're talking Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian, Indian, Asian. I mean, we have so many people who have been lumped into this category that they've got to be talking about heterogeneity and hybridity when they want to talk about justice. And of course, many African descent and Black Americans view justice from the standpoint of reparation. In other words, what is it that we're going to do to be just to people that we have taken so much away from? And I want to be clear, reparations is not a new idea in America. We certainly have paid them before, and after the Civil War, we paid them to former owners of enslaved people because they had, quote, lost their property. So it isn't a foreign idea. It is an idea that is a very American idea when we talk about justice. Now, I wonder about education's understanding of justice, because I think that as educators, we are being asked to focus on social justice without a commitment to basic justice. There's almost no linkage in our justice language in education between justice and racial inequality. Social justice, in some ways, particularly the way I've seen it implemented in schools and colleges and departments of education, is kind of a justice light. In other words, we don't have to deal with the hard issues of criminal justice. We don't have to deal with the hard issues of environmental or economic justice. And I think it's presented this way to education students as the more palatable, politically correct approach to justice. But I asked this question of my own students. Did Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, did they need social justice? Or do they just need justice? When you think about real life people and the real life circumstances that these people have had to endure, you realize that the notion of social justice is in some ways redundant. These folks need justice. And if you're following the trial right now, you know that they have finally seated a jury. And what's kind of striking to me is that the defendant, a lawyer, has said over and over, this is not a trial about race, but he's asked every person of color on that jury, in that jury pool, what do they think about Black Lives Matter? Well, if it's not about race, why are you asking me this question? So we want to see how justice is played out in this, real-time case. So I think as long as we avoid demanding justice, I didn't say social justice, as long as we avoid demanding justice, we will continue to divorce student achievement from justice. In other words, when we look at when kids are not doing well, we almost never have a conversation about the lack of justice that makes that possible. As long as we avoid demanding justice, I think we will continue to uncouple the discipline policies that we see in schools from justice. We'll also fail to distinguish the injustice in, say, assignment to honors and AP classes. Last week, I actually visited with a high school class in North Carolina. It was Carborough High School. And I actually sent these young people a fairly difficult, dense piece of writing that I'd done, the piece that I did on education debt. And they did some videos to send back to me in terms of their response. And then I actually met with them. And then this week they sent me some reaction papers. And over, they said, we now understand why our AP classes look like they look. Because back in 3rd grade, our district started deciding who was gifted and who was to go into what was called the LEAP program. And over and over, these young people said, and there were no Black kids ever selected. So how do we know at 8 years old who are the, quote, gifted ones? But you begin to set up this pattern that suggests these folks are more worthy and these are less worthy. And so by the time you get to high school, yes, those folks that you provided all that enrichment to ought to go into honors or AP, but you have disenfranchised those that you didn't pick in 3rd grade, and they struggle to be a part of AP or honors. As long as we avoid demanding justice, we will not acknowledge the injustice of high school graduation rates. So over and over, I think part of this reclaiming the language requires us to reconnect justice to inequity that we see in our schools. As long as we avoid this demanding justice, we will not acknowledge the inverse relationship between the teacher and student populations. We'll continue to try to manipulate numbers. We'll talk about pipelines, but we will not take it up as a justice issue. In education, social justice, what you will see is a glossing over of opportunity hoarding among many of the collegians and teacher candidates that we have. It's a kind of the rich get richer as you look at who gets into our programs, who gets sponsored through those programs, who ends up being certified and ends up in classrooms. The social justice that we tend to teach in education also fails to acknowledge our misplaced priorities. So we have all this discourse around self-esteem. You know, oh, they just have poor self-esteem. They have low self-esteem. But we have that conversation in the place of an authentic intellectual development of the people we say need to be teachers. We need to really focus on what their intellectual lives are so that as they go into classrooms, they will focus on the intellectual development of the students and not just thinking about having students feel better about themselves. The social justice that we see in education often focuses on talk, not action, or actions unrelated to the lives of students. And I give this example here of saving the rainforest. It's not to say that that's not a worthy thing to do, but I can tell you that I have been in many, many classrooms where kids are working on saving the rainforest. And when I talk to them about, number one, where is the rainforest? They will tell me, I don't really know. And number two, when I say, well, why are you guys doing this? Well, I don't know. This is something she wants to do, referring to the teacher. So not taking action on real things that kids are coping with in their lives. And I think that education social justice often blames others without being accountable. What has been education's role in the injustice that students experience? What it does is it cultivates sympathy rather than what I would call informed empathy. Sympathy is, I feel so bad that this is happening to you. But the unspoken word of sympathy is, but I'm glad it's not happening to me. Informed empathy says, you know what, I know things are tough, but I'm gonna still hold you to a high standard. I know things are tough, and let me walk with you through this toughness right now. That's, you know, this distinction between sympathy and empathy doesn't show up in most of our teacher education programs. The lack of justice, I think, contributes to what I've called the education debt, which is historical, it's economic, it is socio-political, and it is moral. And hopefully in our Q&A, we can talk specifically about these components. But now I want to shift to what I'm calling a tale of four pandemics, and it's been articulated somewhat in the conversation before it got started. Everyone knows the novel coronavirus one. More and more of us are being confronted with what I would call the anti-Black racism that is relevant here. And it's a pandemic because it's happening everywhere. When George Floyd was murdered, it was not just people in the US who reached out to me. I got emails and calls from colleagues in the UK saying, you know what, we have the same foolishness going on. I got calls and emails from colleagues in France who said, yeah, we're doing the same stuff. In Toronto, in Canada, we're doing this. In Brazil, in New Zealand. So it is pandemic. The other one that I think is on the horizon is economic collapse. We did see the Congress invest some money to try to shore up the economy, but the truth of the matter is it's too late for a lot of people. More than 2 million women have left the workforce, so much so that economists are calling it not a recession, but a she-cession, because women have had to come home and be caregivers to seniors as well as to their own children. People are on the brink around eviction from apartments or home foreclosure. So our kids are having to deal with that. And then of course, the fourth pandemic is the coming environmental catastrophe. I use this fire photo because all of my grandchildren live in California. And in conversations with them this summer, they would say, well, yeah, I normally go work out, Grandma, I go to the track, I do this, I do that, but really couldn't do it because the quality of the air is so bad. Even though we're not right near the fire, it has an impact on us. For those of you who have family, friends, and loved ones in the Gulf Coast region, you know that this past summer was one of the worst storm seasons we've seen. More storms, more intense storms. So all four of those things are happening. And I think the inclination would be to kind of wring our hands and say, oh my gosh, we are doomed. But I want to suggest that these four pandemics provide us with an opportunity, at least as educators. And I take my cue from an Indian novelist by the name of Arundhati Roy. Roy says the following about pandemics. And that is that historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. But this one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway. It's between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead skies behind us, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So think about that. The idea that we could be imagining another world, that the pandemic in some ways is a full stop for us to do something very different. So what I keep saying to folks is let's not go back to normal. Let's engage in what I call an education reset. Because I think the pandemic provides an opportunity to move towards justice. Justice in education, things like assessment and access and community engagement, in dismantling the carceral state, looking at prison sentencing and policing, in economic level setting, things like student loan debt and minimum wage, in healthcare. I mean, the COVID care, they didn't ask you for a card or evidence of insurance or anything around this COVID. If you had COVID, we needed to take care of you. The same thing has happened with the vaccine. You just can get the vaccine. the pandemic has given us this opportunity to stop doing some of the stuff we have done in the past. And then it's also a time for what I would call a cultural reset. And so I've been really enamored of things like how many Black folks I know just fell in love with Hamilton just because what the cast looked like. And of course it came to us on, through our TV screens. We didn't have to pay a mortgage payment to go to a theater to see it. Or Bridgerton, which just mixed up all the racial identities. And then I use this example of my sort of guilty pleasure during the pandemic, YouTube channel called Twins, the New Trend. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this next slide. What opportunities we have to reset the academy. A lot of times when we talk about reset in education, we're always talking PK-12. But this is an opportunity for the academy, colleges and universities, to break out of the disciplinary and epistemological silos. So fields like environmental studies and human biology and bioethics, they don't just live in one department. They cut across departments. And this is an important opportunity for us as educators to be pushing that. Begin to cross into institutional boundaries, the campus and community, and our discourse communities. It's an opportunity for us to rethink the funding model. I don't think the funding model we have is sustainable. And so we should be asking questions about what our international peers do to fund their colleges and universities. For the most part, that their governments fund them. It's a time for us to rethink the reward system. Things like faculty service and advising and, quote, diversity work. Most people take on the diversity work on a campus, on a college campus, as extra work because they don't get credited for doing it. And rethinking the place of diversity in the academy. So if you have someone who is in charge of diversity on your campus, do they have the direct line reporting to the institutional head? Or do they have to go through several layers of bureaucracy to get an idea to the president or the chancellor or the provost? And also rethinking the instructional delivery systems. How we do the learning has got to change. This is true for PK-12 as well as our academy. I think before this pandemic, we just thought those IT people were over there to fix our internet or to get our emails back when we switched over to Outlook. Now, I think we understand they need to be central to the teaching learning enterprise. Now, I'm not going to play this particular video just because my time is running out, but these are the twins from Twins, the New Trend. And I've become so enamored of these young people because they are showing a different enthusiasm towards learning that I said that any teacher had 2 kids in their classroom that was this exciting about learning something new, they would just, you'd go home every day from work 5 feet off the ground because these 2 guys are so excited about what we think of as old music. This particular video is the first time they heard Boys to Men ever, which many of us will go, what? Yeah, they've got a whole catalog of songs. And I thought it was just me because I just loved them. And I every day couldn't wait to see for them to release a new video. Well, it turns out President Obama loves them too. And there's at least one video where he's talking to them because they're going through his playlist. So this is what I mean about crossing these boundaries. We don't have to be locked into narrow and constricted ways of thinking about knowledge. I also want to talk about hip hop as an opportunity for justice, because I think if you really understand what hip hop is, it is the notion of flipping something out of nothing. And it's kind of what we've had to do in this pandemic. It's a notion of staying fresh. You can't keep doing the same old things. The classrooms and teachers who have struggled through this pandemic often are people who have tried to keep doing the same old stuff. It's the people who change things up. And it's also about being creatively resourceful. So I'm not just talking about that you know the top 20 hip hop songs. I'm suggesting that you began to do these 3 things. And you see some pictures here. One is a podcast that I actually was on called Hip Hop Can Save America. And for those of you who paid attention, that's DJ D Nice. He really got us through the early part of the pandemic, where there were parties, where there were people you wouldn't expect to be there. Michelle Obama was there. Bernie Sanders was there. I mean, all kinds of entertainers and public figures in a common space. And when you think of the importance of that kind of common space engagement for democracy, then you begin to understand it's not just about the music, it's about our understanding our common experience as Americans. So I'm going to wrap up with an example of what this might look like in the school. I'm just going to be a few minutes over my 30 minutes, so let's see how this works. This is a young man that I have had the opportunity to teach.
Neighborhoods are ovens with windows. And as the knob on global warming increases, lives are preheated until a soul souffles. Pancake stack projects are poured over with a humid as thick as molasses. Heat and humidity are the perfect appetizer on death's plate. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet from May to October, and senior citizen discount is every day. If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. So that 90% release of excess body heat talked about in science class is contributed to our local temperature rising. We crack open fire hydrants until we hear lights crying, raising taxes by lowering our body temperature. And if you couldn't afford a wind replacer, fridges and freezers were propped open until your two brothers' faces are frozen. Audiences applaud the ice cream man once that familiar jingle mingles with our ears. This sweet release of flooded heat is a godsend. But what do you know? The ice cream vendor's name is Noah. As the temperature rises, so do attitudes, death rates, bills, and ice cream stocks. Heat affects the elderly more than it does us. Their lungs resemble the Dow Exchange, rises and drops until they crash. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant. And we have only just begun to fry.
So what you saw was an 18-year-old Elijah Forquan. I will tell you that Elijah is 27 years old. He has a degree from the University of Wisconsin in environmental studies, and he works as a climate scientist. On the weekend, he still does spoken word performance. We were able to take what he had to bring with him. He was enrolled in our very innovative first wave hip hop art scholars program. Let him study at the university, earn a degree, perform, hone his craft. And for those of you who saw Miss Amanda Gorman at the inauguration, Amanda is someone that I had a chance to select at 18 as a part of the US. I'm on the panel that selects the US National Nobel Youth Laureate, excuse me. I'm watching my time, so I'm feeling bad and I'm starting to go over a little bit. But I want to point out this point about Amanda and even Elijah, because I've said over and over, these people are not extraordinary. That's all I've heard. Oh, she's extraordinary. She's not extraordinary. She's outstanding and she's quite good. But I want to tell you, there are thousands of young people like that. When we wade through these submissions for the Youth National Poet Laureate, they're brilliant, all of them. And yet our children are treated like they're not. And we treat someone like Amanda or even an Elijah like they're an exception. They're not exceptional. But if we move towards justice, we will begin to see them as who they truly are. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and I hope I've left enough time. Let's see where I think I'm actually not too bad. And okay.
Well, thank you for your remarks, Dr. Ladson-Billings. It's powerful sharing these examples from young people who should be the norm. They're brilliant, and nurturing them is our goal as educators. We'll hear a response a bit later, but first we have some time for a few questions for Dr. Ladson-Billings. And I'll facilitate that for you. The first question I have is from Jared Lancer. What are your thoughts on strategies for dismantling the Eurocentric literacy approaches as a profession, which not only fails African American students, but also the majority of all K-12 students in every student demographic, including whites in the United States?
So excellent question. And I'm actually not someone who doesn't think we should. I still think Shakespeare belongs in the canon. I think that Mark Twain belongs in the canon, but they need to be there alongside of some other stuff. We have this notion that our kids can only do one thing at a time. I'm someone who would still teach Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but I would teach it alongside Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. So now we have a conversation about, well, what's going on here? Why is this person describing the continent in one way and this person in another way? What advantage does Achebe bring to it? That's the kind of thinking our students have to do to be able to be good decision makers. If I were teaching high schoolers and I had to teach Julius Caesar, I would pair it with some episodes of The Wire or Tony Soprano or even Power. You got to be selective because some of this stuff gets over the edge. It's not that the kids haven't seen it, but we have community standards. But this notion of blind ambition and inability to trust those closest to you, those are themes that run through the literature and through popular culture that kids can understand. So my sense is what you do is you don't, quote, dismantle as much as you break open the sort of Eurocentric curriculum and say, here's what it affords and here's what it doesn't. And here's some other things that help us raise important questions about it.
Thank you. As a social studies educator, I can connect to that in a very personal way. I have another question from Kristen DeVivra. How can we measure, analyze, and evaluate whether, as educators, we are succeeding at fostering an anti-racist classroom?
I'm not sure the term measure is the one that I might use. We are a society that's enamored with measurement. And the problem is we end up with one measure. And if you've only got one tool, the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail. And I just want to make sure that our levels of accountability are beyond just the limited notions of assessment that we now have. Now, I will tell you, because of this pandemic, and I've been in a lot of conversations as the National Academy president with folks who do assessment, folks from ETS, folks from the College Board, who are all saying, we don't know if we can go back to that same old way. I listened to a podcast the other day from This American Life that really talked about more and more colleges and universities are moving away from requiring ACT and SAT. Lots of schools doing test optional. I know we are not using the ACT in Wisconsin this year. I don't know if we'll continue to do that. Texas, when it went to its legal settlement of top 10%, has found that it hasn't hurt their student population. So even the top 10% of a poor high school has been able to, once they provide the necessary supports, once they're on campus, those kids have been able to thrive too. So I think it's not how can we assess, but what does assessment need to look like to really tell us something?
Yeah, that's important work yet to be done. We have a question from Lisa Bass. What is your definition of equity, and how does equity interplay with justice?
Equity is one of those words that I'm less enamored of these days. I speak to a lot of people, a lot of conferences that call themselves DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's again, one of those places where I think the language is obscuring what needs to happen. And I think that as soon as people hear equity, some people gravitate towards it, and there's a whole group of people who shut completely off because they think they're going to lose something in the process. But justice is a fundamental principle. It's, justice is written into our documents, liberty and justice for all. 14th Amendment, equal justice under the law. So I want to try to pull us back to some foundational stuff and say, no, just give me justice. That's what I want. I want a just society. I want us to live up to the ideals that we set out in the beginning. The marvelous thing about living in America is no matter what we may have done, we set such a high bar for ourselves. When people say to me, oh, well, you sound like you're bashing America. Not at all. I'm holding America to her standards. She should have never wrote that stuff down. I was a social studies educator too, US history. I literally have a constitution in my backpack right now. I don't go anywhere without it. It's a marvelous document. So nothing in that document says equity, but it says justice. And I want to hold our feet to the fire around justice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think something we can probably all agree on. Wayne Williams asked a question as well. Would you be willing to speak more about the idea of opportunity hoarding, how it takes place and its consequences?
Yeah, I think another way to think about opportunity hoarding is the rich get richer. In other words, people don't mind having AP classes as long as their children get into AP classes. They don't mind having sort of special programs, honors, and what have you, as long as their children get access to it. And we see it happening over and over again. So let me give you a pretty extreme example. Back in the 1970s, when California went to pass the sort of taxpayers' bill of rights, what was called Proposition 13, they essentially said, we're not paying any more of these property taxes, which meant that schools had to shut down lots of programs that they saw as somewhat elective. But I lived in Palo Alto. So my kids are in a community that is filled with resources. So all of the things that couldn't happen in a nearby community because it was a poorer community continued to happen. Palo Alto is one of the districts that started the first public school foundation. So now it's the school no longer buying, building the library, the foundation's building it because they have those resources. Or where other schools said, well, we can't have these art and music classes, we just can't afford it. The Palo Alto Foundation, which made up of parents, pool their resources and make sure their children still get those things. So opportunity hoarding really speaks to the notion that, again, the rich get richer, that even if the opportunity is out there for everyone, certain people grab it and hold on to it.
We have another question from Megan Lefevre that relates to this concept a little bit. She asked, what are your viewpoints on high rates of placement in exceptional children's programs?
By exceptional children, is she talking about, because the terminology is different everywhere, she means special needs?
Well, I think it might be gifted. I don't know. I'm
Okay,
reading
gifted,
the
okay, because
question, but I know you
exceptionality can be on either end of the spectrum,
absolutely.
right?
Mhm.
Well, I literally asked my local superintendent this week to do something for me. I'm working with Madison around an early reading initiative. And I said to him, Dr. Jenkins, here's what I'd like you to do. Cost out how much it would cost if we made taking and passing an advanced placement course a requirement for every single student to graduate. In other words, rather than saying, oh, let me recommend you for AP, or, you'd be a good AP candidate. What if we said everybody should take at least one AP class? And I'm not just saying any class, take an AP class in something you're interested in. If you're interested in music, there are music history classes. Take that. I said, I want you to do that. And then I said, the other thing I'd like you to do is, if that's something we can't pull off, can't get enough teachers who are certified who can teach the AP, can you cost out what it would mean if you made as a requirement for graduating from a Madison Metropolitan High School that every student take at least one college level course? Same principle, not just anything, not English or history or calculus, if you're not interested in that. But the University of Wisconsin has thousands of courses, and there should be something at an early level, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in the sciences, whether it's the social sciences or the humanities, that students should have access to. Like I said, I sent a paper to those students at Carrboro High School. Every last one of them read it. That's a paper that I distribute in a graduate class. And yeah, they struggled through it, but they did do it. And so it gave them a particular experience. I'm less concerned that people get a 4 or a 5 on an AP test than they get a good experience, having been in an enriched experience in, say, US history, if they have that interest. So those are the kinds of shifts and changes. When I talk about a reset, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about us going back to what we were doing, because what we were doing was ensuring that some kids were failing.
Thank you. I want to return to the concept of justice. And this is going to be our last question. We have a lot of questions. I think that's a tribute to how you've inspired us and provoked us to think. But this question comes from Owen Stone, and it's particularly relevant, I think, for us all. What mechanisms should be in place for universities to hold themselves accountable when they deny basic justice to students, faculty, and staff? How, too, do we effectively break open the injustices of the university system and place them in public view?
Excellent question. And I would say that universities that have an ombudsman program for faculty and staff need to extend that program to students. That you have someone that students can appeal to, because of the current system. Your appeal is often to the very person that is being unjust to you. You appeal to a faculty member that isn't treating you the right way, or you appeal to a dean who is supporting that faculty member. But if we can have an ombuds program, and it's actually something that I've really urged at the PK level for parents, because sometimes parents get into these dust-ups with folks because they don't have an advocate attached to the process. And so without having someone who understands the system, who says, here are your rights, here's what you should be able to do. I think similarly, universities should have some responsibility, and particularly state universities. I've been on this soapbox about the lack of state support for its own institutions. Over my 27 years at Wisconsin, I've seen the state contribution to our budget steadily go down. When I first got there and saw what the state contributed, I used to say, the University of Wisconsin is a state-assisted university. It's not a state university, it's state-assisted. But as I watched that number shrink, the proportion of dollars go down, 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 I now refer to the University of Wisconsin as a state located university. I studied geography. I'm absolutely positively sure that that university is in that state. And that's about it. I can say nothing about what the state does to support it. So I think in our state institutions in particular, there needs to be some level of recourse as well as transparency. And I think we have an opportunity in this sort of pandemic moment to rethink what we mean by campus community partnerships. And I think we should take advantage of it.